Retrospectives.
Good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the back row from What I Watched Tonight. Specifically, this is episode 1, number 1 of Retrospectives. In these recurring shows, I'm going to be chatting about my favourite films, alongside a guest who just so happens to love that movie too. And tonight, for the first episode, for number 1, we're diving into the horror genre, or psychological or thriller territory, depending on your view, and we're discussing The Exorcist III, from 1990. And along for the ride is the Pride of Scotland. It's Kevin Crighton. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. I spoke to Kev about a year and a bit ago now, and we spoke some classic horror, modern horror, international horror, but also The Exorcist III. And I've finally found someone who appreciated the movie as much as I did, and I haven't actually forgotten that. Now, Kevin's the man behind the Grump of Horror blog, and can regularly be seen at horror festivals. So firstly, how's the blog going? And have you been to any of these festivals recently?
The blog's going very well, actually. I've just finished updating it from the Fright Fest festival. It was in London in August.
Yes.
And that was a lot of fun. Met a lot of good people there.
I was going to go to that this year, but I just life got in the way. But I remember you went last year, or I think last time we spoke to you, you said how good it was, and it's something I've wanted to do. I look at the lineup, and I think this looks incredible. Put you on the spot now. Was there any kind of unheralded gems or ones to look out for?
My favourite film of the festival is actually out on DVD already. It's called the Banana Splits movie. I absolutely loved that film.
I haven't seen that one.
It came out on DVD in August. But that one is out. Of the ones yet to come, I was a big fan of The Wind, which is a sort of psychological Western horror film.
I've heard of that. I think I read something about it either online or somebody posted something about it the other day, but it may have even been yours, but I read something about that and it sounded pretty good.
It is a very, very good film.
And what isn't very good is my memory. Before the show, I was asking Kevin, I tried to remember where Kevin was from in Scotland, as if you hadn't heard, he's a fine Scotsman. Whereabouts in Scotland, just for my own benefit, are you calling from?
I'm in Cooper Angus, which is about halfway between. It's sort of between Perth and Dundee, distance-wise, about 13 miles from each. That's
right, because I thought it was Dundee, then I thought Perth, and I couldn't remember. So Cooper Angus, that's right, the Pride of Cooper Angus. So let's talk some Exorcist III. This film's nearly 30 years old now, which sounds mad. Directed by William Peter Blatty, based on his own novel Legion, and this is viewed as the true sequel to The Exorcist. Did you ever read Legion? And I guess, when did you actually first see this film? Because it's nearly 30 years old now.
I have read Legion. I read it. I can't remember if I read it before I saw the film or after I saw the film, to be honest. But I did read it because I read The Exorcist and then went straight on to Legion after that. As for the film itself, I saw it on its original cinema release in 1990.
Wow. Which
was a very memorable screening.
Where was that? Was it busy in that? Because obviously the box office looks quite good. 39 million bucks worldwide, off an 11 million budget. So it looked quite good from that side. But in terms of actually being there, was there a lot of people there? Was there any hype?
At that particular screening, there wasn't that many people at it. Mm-hmm. Because it was like a sort of mid-afternoon screening.
Okay.
But there had been a trailer played about the week before, but beyond that, and a poster, obviously. But at the cinema itself, there was very little advertising of the film.
Man, I think I first saw this film about 20 years ago. So turn of the millennium, and I had seen The Exorcist before. Of course, listeners will know it's my favourite film of all time. And of course, there is a film in between Exorcist and Exorcist III. But I saw this film about 20 years ago, and it's stayed with me ever since. So, in terms of the film, before we go into it, let's get the admin out of the way. It stars George C. Scott as Lieutenant Kinderman and Ed Flanders as Father Dyer, two characters who reprise their roles from the original film. Brad Dorf as the Gemini Killer, another returning character, Jason Miller as Patient X, Nicole Williamson as Father Morning, amongst others. And what's it about? The synopsis says that Kinderman notices similarities between his current murder investigation and the methods used by the Gemini Killer, who was executed 15 years before. Now, this film is set 15 years after the original Exorcist. He soon discovers a hospitalised mental patient claiming to be the dead serial killer, but he looks an awful lot like a priest Kinderman knew who died during an exorcism. I wonder who could that be? As more bodies are found, Kinderman looks for connections between the two supposedly dead men. And as a warning, there will be spoilers for the movie throughout, because we're going to be discussing specific moments throughout. It's quite impossible not to. So do bear that in mind. If you haven't seen the film, please, by all means, do yourself a favour. Go and watch it, and then come back 2 hours later and listen to me and Kevin speaking about it. So, Kev, let's go for it then. The Exorcist III. What is it about it which you obviously love so much?
At the time, from what I vaguely remember of the horror genre, a lot of it was like Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street type films, which don't get me wrong, I do enjoy, but the Boogeyman type of thing, and slasher films and whatnot. And this was, frankly, something completely different. I mean, if you think about it, the cast, it's older actors. It's not a young cast.
Yeah.
It plays it completely straight. Yes, there are one or two lines that are funny, but it's a very, very straight-played horror film. And two, it just scares the hell out of me.
Which is what you want from a horror film. And I like the fact you mentioned about the comedy, because the lines that are used for laughs, they're not explicit. They're not kind of, it isn't a line and then everybody kind of winks at the camera waiting for you to laugh. It's organic. The way that Blatty's written it, it's really well done. And some of the lines in this are actually quite funny, usually between Dyer and Kinderman, their exchanges. About this, for me, I mean, the first thing I've got to say is I had the fortune of coming out after the soiled nappy that was Exorcist II, The Heretic, John Borman's utter disaster. And with Blatty on board, there was a chance that this could actually be a pretty solid sequel. However, it also suffered from coming after The Heretic, because that movie was so badly released, it tainted this film upon release. And you also had, what was it? Leslie Nielsen's Repossessed came out about a month later, which Linda Blair starred in as well. So the film, it's interesting when you say about how many people were at your cinema, because this film was rushed out in order to firstly beat Repossessed into cinemas, because they were worried that was actually going to ruin the film altogether. But turns out that The Exorcist II has such a bad effect on this film that it didn't do all that well. And the reason I bring that up is because it's a damn fine film. It's a really good film, and what you say is true. It is more of a straight up horror film, but it's the kind of horror that I like. It's not all slasher, all gore. It's that psychological. You don't see things, and Blatty makes a great point of not showing anything, but he explains it, and it's not in a heavy-handed expositionary way, but he explains it, and it leaves it up to your imagination, and that's what I think is the most horrifying thing as well. It's also got a really good atmosphere, which is what I liked. It for me, it felt more like, well, quite a lot like the first film. Because of that, there was a lot of silence throughout the movie, or just ambient noises. Wasn't an awful lot of music, so for me anyway, yeah, the atmosphere was one of the things I liked about it.
Yeah, the thing that really got me about it was that it tied in obviously with the events of The Exorcist, but in such a way that you didn't have to have seen The Exorcist to see The Exorcist III.
Yeah,
it mentioned the events of the first film, but that was it, only in passing because of connection between the victims. But what was curious also was, I think it was Fangoria magazine, right about the same time, because I was reading the magazine at that point. They actually had some snapshots of scenes that weren't in the film. For example, the death of the priest in the confession box.
Yes,
which is a really creepy scene. When you see a photograph taken, you see the blood inside the box. I'm sure it was Fangoria, or a magazine like that had a shot of the body in there. And I'm glad they took it out, not because it looked fake or anything like that. I just think it's more powerful not seeing the bodies than actually seeing them. That's the
one of the priest holding his own head. Is that the one?
I think that's the one that sprung to mind. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great shot, but had they left that in, it would have jarred with everything else, because there wasn't any other, death scenes in there. And that scene is. There's one scene which we know, which everybody listening who's seen the film, we're going to talk about it. But that confession box scene is probably my second favourite scene of the film, just because it's the way it's framed, the way it's shot, and it is so creepy. And the voice, and forgive me, I can't remember the actress's name now, but she was married to George C. Scott, twice in fact, who actually did the voice for that scene, is so creepy. And it's just the way she says, just the way, like, at the end, all this bleeding, and the priest's face, as he realises just what's about to happen, and the demonic voice that kind of seeds into the priest's wife screaming, and it's a really harrowing noise.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, the way also the voice starts off nice and calm.
Yeah.
She's like an old woman confessing to what you think is going to be just trivial sins, and then of course she talks about killing somebody, and then the mess of the blood and how she got better at dealing with that, and you can just feel the horror growing as to where this is going.
And again, you don't see anything, which is great.
Yeah, which is why we'll come on to it probably. The exorcism at the end is so jarring.
Yes, yeah, and I guess we'll let's mention that now because it's a well-known story that Blatty's original vision for the film was an awful lot different to what Morgan Creek and Warner Brothers actually wanted, because they wanted an exorcism. They said, listen, this is an exorcist film. We want an exorcism. Blatty wanted to call it Legion to start with, partly to not have anything to do with Exorcist 2, not to put people off. So we got an exorcism scene, which is where they got Nico Williamson in as Father Morning. And as a standalone scene, what do you think about it? If you just saw that scene, would you buy it? And then obviously in the context of the film as well.
The problem with that, I mean, there are many problems with that scene. Famously, George C. Scott is quoted as saying that the studio wouldn't have been happy until Madonna turned up at the end singing a song. But the main problem with that scene is it almost unbalances the film in a sense. Mm-hmm. Because up until that scene, it's very low key. Yes, you've got the scene we'll talk about later on, but you do, and the scene with his daughter towards just before that.
Yes.
Before the exorcism. But then the Father Morning stuff, which you can clearly see has been added because he never interacts with any other character.
He doesn't say anything as well either during the film, apart from the end.
Yeah, and it's so... Okay, when you look at the exorcism scene in the original film, in The Exorcist, and then you look at this one here, I mean, snakes, things coming out the ground and everything else. Yes, you could argue it's all an imaginary, all in their heads of what they're seeing, but it's just really disappointing. That being said, George C. Scott's speech about faith, where he starts going on how he believes. Mm-hmm. Earlier in the film, his beliefs kind of wavering at best. But at the end of the film, he does believe. And it's a very good speech. It's just a shame it comes in all this overblown bit nonsense, which really wasn't needed.
Yeah, that speech gets a lot of flack because, again, people take one particular line and run with it, which is when he says, I believe in slime. As if that's the only thing he says. Because before that, I mean, he believes in death, disease, torture, anger, hate, murder, pain, and everything else. And slime went along with stink and everything else. That was just a line in it. And the reason I like that line, or that particular speech, is because it almost felt like George C. Scott was kind of just improvising on the spot, coming up with everything he could, and then kind of throwing something like slime and stink and every crawling, putrid thing. And I like... To be fair, I like George C. Scott in the entire film. I like him in that scene, but I do agree when, hell literally starts to rise out of the ground and the lightning strikes and, breaks open the wall of the floor, of the holding cell, it does feel like a completely different film. And the exorcism in the first film is so masterfully done because for the vast majority of the time, it keeps it as, I mean, how do I say this without saying mental? As grounded and realistic as possible. You don't particularly have things flying around other than obviously Reagan floating, but she's not kind of flying around the room or crawling off the ceiling or anything weird like that. So this did feel thrown in, but I mean, I think they could have used the Father Morning character better if they'd had more time, but it does feel tacked on. And we mentioned beforehand that Shout Factory released the director's cut. And I know I haven't seen it either. I've only seen bits of it. But from what you know of it, I'm guessing you would have preferred that story?
Yeah, I mean, in the original novel, I'm going to spoil the end of the Legion for a moment. As I said, there's no exorcism at all in the novel. Mm-hmm. And, but, yeah, so it would be interesting to see how they would have played that ending in, because it's a very low-key ending in the novel, from what I remember of it.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to see how the film would have kept that going and made it work in the film, because the way that the Gemini killer part plays into that, because Jason X, for example, Jason Miller, is Patient X. He was never supposed to be there either.
That's right.
He was a late in the day add-on. It was all meant to be Brad Dourif, who is superb. So yeah, it would have been interesting to see how it would have played out. They'd just taken all the added-on stuff, but the special edition version, the Blu-ray from Screen Factory, as I understand it, uses audio storyboards, videotape footage, but they couldn't find the actual proper footage for the film. So they just assembled a version of the film that Blatty would have liked, or rather, was closer to what Blatty had in mind. And I really would like to see it at some point.
Yeah, it's comprised of VHS tapes and the dailies and things like that. So it's mixed in with the film that we've already seen. Did Blatty have a final say over that? Because I believe it was released in, I want to say 2016, and obviously, sadly, Bill Blatty passed away in 2017. So, in one hand, I'm extremely glad that he got to, see his vision realised. But I've never actually read into how much, he obviously would have had a lot of say, but how much collaboration he had on that.
I honestly don't know myself. I would imagine at the very least it was based on suggestions that he had, notes that he had. Perhaps they had a script to work from, the original script. I really don't know. I have to be honest, the best person to ask on that might be Mark Kermode.
Yeah, Mark Kermode we know he loves The Exorcist, but he's also a big fan and a big drum banger of this film as well. If you go on YouTube, there's documentaries of him talking about it. And it was him, I think, who pushed for who's been pushing for this footage to be released for God knows how long now. Yeah,
he was involved in trying to find the original footage so they could do the Legion cut as it were, but they just couldn't find it.
Which is a shame, because I would have loved to have seen what it looked, as you mentioned, what it looked like in its final finished form.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I do believe William Peter Blatty himself did do the add-on features like the Exorcism with Father Morning and the Jason Miller footage for the version that was released. But yeah, I do agree. I would love to see what he could have done had he been just left alone to make the film that he wanted to make.
Yeah, I guess we could always just read the book again. But there's something about now that we've got the film, it's almost kind of like those great what ifs, because we've got the film, but it could have been so different, and it so nearly was if Morgan Creek hadn't have misplaced the footage. You mentioned Brad Dourif. He's absolutely insanely good in this film, which he is in most things he does. Brad Dourif is one of the actors who I find very rarely lets you down, whether it's voice acting or physical acting. Obviously, things like Grima Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings, he portrayed that so well. But he's so good in this film, and he's even come out and said about the changes that everybody felt really, really quite bad for Bill Blatty, because the film he originally shot was great, but Dorff's exact words were, "It's now a mediocre film with all the changes." Now, I don't fully agree with that, but I wasn't on set to see how it was originally. But Brad Dourif is fantastic. It's one of those kind of tour de force performances that if it was performed now, with everything, with social media and a greater interaction, people would be screaming about this. But because it's in The Exorcist III, which is, as you mentioned before, like an underrated film, his performance flies under the radar, which is a shame, because he's brilliant and he has some of the best monologues in the entire film.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a sequence in it where he goes from calm to rage back to calm in the space of 2 minutes. Yeah. It's an astonishing sequence where he's basically letting the anger of the character come through, and then he just calms down. It's an amazing performance. I mean, as I say, in the original, as I understand it, in the original cut or the original version, it would have just been him all the way through. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you say, with social media these days and everything else, I could see a push for a possible Oscar nomination. Yeah. I'm not that I'm a fan of the Oscars, admittedly, but I could see him being up for awards because it was that good a performance.
Yeah, he really was, and that scene is great. Yeah, because he's screaming, about the torment of Father Karras, and then he just kind of sits back and says, "Great, was I raving? Please forgive me, I'm mad," which is a great scene. But it's all on camera as well. When he's shifting between his emotions, the camera is focused on him, so it's not like we're cutting away from him and splicing together various cuts. it's just Brad Dourif just going for it, basically. And on the flip side, George C. Scott got a Razzie for this performance. Well, he got a Razzie nomination, and of course, the Razzies are they're frivolous, and they don't mean anything. But come on, George C. Scott was very good in this film.
Oh yeah, he was very, very good. I mean, it's a film where the main character slowly changes through the arc. I mean, he starts off as you could argue he's a bit of yes, he's a priest as a friend, but he's not really a religious person, I would say.
No, I wouldn't say that. Yeah.
Over the events of the film, especially if you look at the exorcism at the end, that belief has come back to a degree. And it's a very, very good performance. I mean, he's very calm all the way through it. Yes, he has moments where he shouts at people, but he's a police detective. That is standard for a police detective. At some point, he will shout at somebody. And he's very, very good at conveying the horror. I mean, with the scene where he first sees the patient X, where we don't actually see who's in the cell at that point.
That's right, he just says, Bill.
Yeah, but no, it's when he first goes into the cell.
Yeah.
And then he's kind of backing away in horror. I mean, he doesn't say a word, but the look on his face conveys his utter shock at what he's saying. It's the little details like that. I mean, he's really, really good. And I don't think, I mean, I don't rate the Razzies anyway, but it's not a Razzie performance at any level at all. It's a very, very good performance.
Yeah. The other scene where I think a reactionary scene where I think he's very good is when he has to look at the body of his best friend, Father Dyer. Again, there's no music in this scene, which is just how it should be. It's just the noise of the rain outside, and that isn't as dramatic as it sounds. But just his face as he's having to firstly comprehend what he's having to look at, and also absorb what he's looking at. And then when his colleagues, are pointing out that everything, all these little tubs on the side of Father Dyer's blood and how they got it out, and just his face, and you can see this kind of anguish building up inside him, and that's something which I think he does throughout the film. Again, like I say, he starts off kind of, George C. Scott-esque, big and brash, and as the film goes on, he doesn't descend into any kind of state, but you can see him changing throughout the film, obviously, because people around him are dying. Something's going wrong. Father Karras, who is, apparently somebody you loved, and I'll speak about that later on, but he's apparently come back. So everything he's got to comprehend, he does such a good job of actually showing how he's struggling to do it. And remember, this is an Academy Award-winning actor. He's no slouch.
Yeah. I mean, if you've seen him in, for example, The Changeling, the horror film from I think it was 1980, he's very, very good. He was also in Firestarter as well. I mean, he has made a few horror films in his career.
He was in Patton, obviously, Doctor Strangelove.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very, very good actor. And yes, some actors do tend to get a bit over the top at times, but he doesn't in that film. He's very controlled. Even the moments where he explodes with anger at somebody, it's still a controlled performance.
Yeah, like when he's in the when he's mourning essentially Father died, everything that's going on, and he's in his office or in the police station, and everybody around him is screaming and shouting, and he just slams his hand down on the filing cabinet and just screams for everyone to shut up. And you can just see him at that moment where he kind of just breaks down and then has to compose himself. People could say, again, one of those moments where he goes too far. But consider, in the context of the film, what a human being is dealing with, is totally justified. And everything, all of his major reactions in the film are totally justified.
Well, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it starts off as your, I don't want to say standard, but you're like routine police procedural. Dead bodies, police investigating. And obviously, as the film progresses, it heads into more sort of religious, spiritual / supernatural territory, if you will. And all the way through, you could argue his character's playing catch up to a degree. He also seems to know what's going on, but he just refuses to admit to it until the end. And when he does, I think his belief comes back to him.
Yeah, it's a performance where you can see his arc, like we've said, and the fact that he got, even if it's a bit of a laugh, even the fact that he got nominated for something as ridiculous as a Razzie is even embarrassing, even for them. But this is a film full of very good performances. Jason Miller comes back as Patient X. Obviously, Jason Miller was Father Karras, as we know in the first film, and I thought Jason Miller was magnificent in The Exorcist. I honestly thought he was, the man's eyes in the first film are just haunted. And I think he's very good in this film as well. I don't think he'd done an awful lot of acting prior to this film, because I think he had a few issues, which is part of the reason why he couldn't be in the first cut of the film. But the fact that he got him in, and he wasn't in, like I say, he wasn't in the original version of the film. Talking about the theatrical cut, I like what they did with his character. Now, obviously, the idea of having him brought back after his fate in The Exorcist has always felt slightly, iffy to me, but it's explained in the film well. But Jason Miller being in it, I liked. It gave me that tissue between The Exorcist. I thought he was very good as well.
I think it's a change that, and I understand Brad Dourif's unhappiness with how the finished film turned out. And yeah, Brad Dourif had been all the way through the film. I wouldn't have had a problem with that whatsoever. But having said that, by bringing Jason Miller back, I think it kind of works to the sense of it gives it a bit more of a connection to the first film by ignoring the second one. If you know what I mean? Because by bringing him back with this whole idea, with the whole, basically his body was kind of reunited was combined with this Gemini killer, and then basically effectively crawled out of the grave. But it gives fans, if you will, a connection, because while the characters are the same, is all the actors are different in the sense of George C. Scott wasn't in the original film. I think it was Stanley Hayden. I think
Lee J. Cobb.
Sorry, Lee J. Cobb, and so on. So I think they possibly need an actor who was in the first one to come back and appear in this one, even if it was just a small two or three scenes, if you will. So I can understand why William Peter Blatty, when he was maybe forced to make changes, decided to bring him back. I just wish they didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
I think that it would have added a more air of mystery if they hadn't had to do that, bring him back. I just relied on Brad Dourif instead.
Just Brad Dourif by himself is just fine. Another thing which goes to Blatty's story being changed was there was two studios who were vying for this story. Morgan Creek, who eventually got it, and Carol Co. Obviously, everybody has heard of Carol Co. They both wanted to make the film, but Carol Co., this studio, suggested that for The Exorcist III, we could have a grown-up Reagan McNeil giving birth to possessed twins. Carol went out of business 5 years later. It would be no surprise to anyone, but when you hear something like that, does Morgan Creek's version suddenly not sound quite so bad?
Morgan Creek are a company that, they did fund the Exorcist III, but you can clearly see I would say probably 80% of that film, it's William Peter Blatty's vision, with 20% Morgan Creek's vision. Maybe more film critics would disagree. That's personally my own view. But then you look at things like The Exorcist: The Beginning, which Morgan Creek did, which was like the prequel to The Exorcist, and they also made Dominion, which incidentally I think is the better film of the two prequels. Isn't it? Yeah, I think the Paul Schrader's film is far better than the one they eventually released. But you can see how bad things can get when they don't involve the people behind it. John Boorman went completely off the rails with Exorcist II. I don't want to keep bringing Mark Kermode up, but apparently in one of his blogs he was talking about how basically Boorman basically didn't like The Exorcist and basically went completely the other way to try and disassociate his film with The Exorcist.
Even though it carries the same title.
Yeah, and whereas Morgan Creek presumably thought when Peter Blatty was going to make Legion, thought, oh, it's an Exorcist film, we're going to get a good film here, and then realised that what he was making wasn't what they wanted. So I think, while Morgan Creek have made some good films, don't get me wrong, I think they really botched The Exorcist III and certainly botched the prequels as well.
I was so excited for the prequels because it's The Exorcist. And whilst The Heretic was a train wreck, Exorcist III is fantastic. And I was so excited to see what the beginning was, because that was the one that theatrically released Exorcist the beginning. We were going to see Father Merrin, before in his first duel with Pazuzu. Pazuzu. But what we got was awful, to be honest. And it's funny that this film has got nothing to do with The Heretic. Brilliant Peter Blatty has made that clear. But I read something a while ago that when they show the shot of the famous stairs, which are now called the Exorcist stairs, they shoot it in such a way that you can't see the McNeil house, because obviously in The Heretic that's inexplicably just destroyed. So there's that kind of I think they were fairly conscious of that. And something else as well, that they mention Reagan like once, I think, in this film, but they just call her the McNeil kid. The Heretic, it gives you the story of Reagan, Sharon, the nanny, Father Merrin, and also mentions Chris McNeil. Whereas this film also then goes on to give you the sort of the fate of Kinderman, Dyer, and Father Karras. So in two films which are unconnected, you get the tying up of everybody's fate, whether or not Blatty meant for that or not, which I thought was quite a strange sort of twist of fate. But it works well, even if you ignore the fact that The Heretic is a film.
Yeah. Regarding the steps, the shots of the steps, I would agree that it was interesting when they shot it, not showing the house. I mean, I think you do get the brief flashback to Father Merrin going out the window.
Father Karras.
Karras going out the window and then going down the stairs. But I suspect that's more to do with maybe the owners of the house just not wanting their film to be another horror.
And actually, they had to build an extension on the house, didn't they? So that's probably why it wasn't in there, because they'd have had to rebuild that extension.
Yeah. So, but I hadn't actually considered your point about the fates of the characters. It's an interesting one, but I do think that sometimes the sequels, well, certainly Exorcist 2, just handled it so badly that you can't take what happened to those characters seriously, really, because even if I think the reason why the Exorcist 3 / Legion is the way it is because Reagan's story finished at the end of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Her story is told. Good has triumphed over evil. She did not need to be involved in any more stories after that. She gets a passing reference in Exorcist 3 because her case is the link that links all the murder victims in that story. But in the case of her story, her actual story, it is done at the end of The Exorcist. So she was never needed for Exorcist 2 anyway. I think they just brought her back because they thought, oh, it's a sequel, we'll bring her back.
Well, apparently the first script was dynamite. Apparently, according to Linda Blair, the first script, which everybody signed on for, was actually pretty good. And it got rewritten sort of 8, 9, 10 times to the point where it was unrecognisable, to the kind of tap dancing, pissed Richard Burton flying on the wings of a demon. James Earl Jones dressed up as a locust, madness we got. And for Bourne's credit, he didn't just go for a straight up shot for shot kind of sequel. He did go for something different, but is the thing. All I can say.
Yeah, as far as Exorcist 2 concerned, all I'll say on that subject is it's a film.
It exists, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I mean, which is why obviously a lot of people just discount it when they talk about the Exorcist 3, which everybody agrees is the proper sequel to The Exorcist.
Thematically, it feels the same.
Yes, it does, and also because it doesn't, with the exception of the exorcism, unfortunately, it feels more real. Whereas a lot of the stuff in the original Exorcist, the medical procedures and everything else, it's all looks real and everything else. In the case of Exorcist 3, with the exception of the dream sequence and the exorcism, it does feel real. It feels plausible. Yes, you've got a psychotic in the cell who claims to be the killer. But that aside, I mean, it does feel like a proper procedural, as opposed to closer to something like maybe, I don't know, Seven, for example, as opposed to something wild out there like Shocker, for example.
It thunders along almost like a mystery at times as well, because we've mentioned it's a horror film, but for quite a lot of the time, it also does kind of play out as a mystery, almost like a thriller, where it's more about the case and unravelling what's happening and trying to catch up to whoever this killer is, rather than, just a straight up horror film. And that is why the first film succeeded so much, because it was patient in its approach, whereas the first film had that, massive ending with the fantastic exorcism scene. This one stumbled on that, but I love the slow burn nature, and that's why I feel like it's a great companion piece. And I mentioned as well the lack of music. When I rewatched this 2 days ago, and I know you rewatched it today, I noticed again that the music is there, but it's not overriding. Whereas horror films nowadays, everything is tempered by the score. You know what's coming because the score allows you, it telegraphs what's happening. Or there is just a music bed. In this film, the music is used when it needs to be, but for the rest of the time, it's just, like I say, the natural sounds of the scene. And I love that about this film.
I mean, I have to give credit to the sound team on Exorcist 3, because you have this like growling sound coming up throughout, and sort of in the background, because it's like an ominous sound, like something's watching over everything that's going on, and it's just a really creepy sound. Like for example, when they reveal the words written on Father Dyer's wall after they find the body, and just little things like that, and the sound when we get to that, when we start talking about that scene. The sound effects in that sequence are really, really cleverly done. So I have to give full credit to the sound design.
No, you're right. And there's a scene at the beginning, the very first scene after the title card, when you get Tubular Bells starting up. It then the camera then follows, from a third person shot of somebody walking down the street, and there's this music, and the growling is so prevalent as that as well. It's just this kind of low, very aggressive but low growling. As if, there's something, like you say, something's watching you, something otherworldly is there. And it wants you to know it's there, but, just on the periphery. And I found that unnerving. And again, it's something this film does well. It's unnerving. It's the things, like the confession box, after that scene with the priest, there's a shot where Kinderman is inside the confession box, and he's moving the little door inside the confession door window backwards and forwards. It's making this kind of scraping, scratching sound. But the camera starts off from a long shot, and it starts to slowly zoom, angled zoom into the box. And we don't know what's in that. It's just this horrible sort of scratching, scraping, banging noise. And with, oh no, what's going on? As the camera's slowly moving in. Again, no music. We don't know what's in there. And then we find out it's Kinderman. But it's little unnerving moments like that. Or when he's talking to the old lady in the madhouse, that scene where she's talking about her radio and her telephone, what it was, toaster, and how that plays out as well, because you're not quite sure what's going on. Something's going on, but Blatty does such a good job, and the screenwriters and everybody else, of framing and setting up their scenes where that kind of puts you on edge. So despite the fact that nothing is really going on, there's just killer atmosphere. You mentioned those dream sequences. What did you think about those as well? Because there's a couple.
I think the dream sequences, would have been more prevalent in Blatty's original cut. The original version. It's an odd sequence to leave in the film, to be honest, considering it doesn't come back. There aren't any more of them. There's that one big scene at the start where he sees Father Dyer, and it kind of hints that Father Dyer's now dead. But it's a very, very good scene. It's very, very clever the way it does it. It's reminded me a lot of A Matter of Life and Death, the Prowl and Pressburger film.
That's a good shout.
In the idea of just not so much about the location, because it's like a hospital for the dead and dying, but the angels being there and everything else, and the music to kind of relax and soothe them. And then you've got Samuel L. Jackson in a very tight, small cameo, although it's not his voice.
Yeah, he dubbed him, didn't they?
Yeah.
Probably because he said the MF word.
It would not surprise me if he did. But I thought as a dream sequence, it was a very good one. I just don't think the film actually needed it. But having said that, had there been more of them throughout the film, I could have understood that.
Yeah.
But by putting just the one in, it just seemed an odd choice. But it was very well done, I thought.
It's really macabre type scene, because you get like there's a statue of the Joker, Batman, the Joker in the corner with a knife, and like I say, there's the angels who are like slamming on the piano whilst with these big grins on their face, and let's say Samuel L. Jackson's there, and Patrick Ewing, I think, basketball players there, and it's all very strange. And the young Kintry boy, who was the first person to die, the young boy, who again whose death is explained, in detail, but you don't see it. He's put up on he's crucified with ingots in his eyes, and he's decapitated, and he was having to watch his own body, and it was, the way they said that was brilliant. But I thought the dream sequences were good, and I guess that one we're mentioning, like a macabre one in the middle, I think kind of existed just to let the audience know that, that Father Dyer was now one of the victims. I think that was pretty much the only real reason for it. I'm trying to think in my head of another way they could have. I mean, I'm not a screenwriter, obviously, but how they could have had the reveal of Father Dyer, dying, but in a different way, because obviously the last time we see them, Father Dyer's in his hospital bed, reading, the Woman's Weekly and the fashion magazines, and he has a nice, passive-aggressive, fun conversation with Kinderman. Then the next scene we see is obviously is Kinderman going into the room, knowing he's passed away. I don't know how. I'm just trying to think in my head. I mean, you may know better, but how they could have potentially set up Father Dyer passing in another way that wasn't a dream sequence.
To be honest, unless they actually hinted at what was done to him in the sense of maybe seeing somebody creeping into his room.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose what they could have done was just done it in a weird way, the kind of how they did it in the film, just by removing the dream sequence and then cutting to the phone ringing, and then finding out like the way he does in the film, and then he rushes to the hospital to find out the body, and just not hinted at it at all. Because I think in a weird way that could have been a bit more of a shock in that the dream sequence kind of sets you up for the fact that you now know he's dead.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, Kinderman gets the phone call to basically say that he is dead. Whereas how he just got the phone call and then rushed to the hospital and we found out that he died, or rather been murdered. I think the shock of that could have been an interesting one to pull off in its own right.
If I remember rightly, in that just as Kinderman leaves from seeing Dyer for the final time, I think there's actually a statue with his head removed, which is kind of meant to be the hint, I guess. But I think you'd have. I mean, to be honest, I don't remember the first time I saw it all that well, but I know I didn't connect that and think, something's going to happen to Father Dyer. It just seemed like a religious iconography that had been defaced. But I guess looking at it now, maybe that was the hint. I guess they could have kept that in and then taken the dream sequence out. As much as I liked the dream sequence, I thought it was good, but it did just come as like a setup for that phone to ring. And I like the idea of him leaving. We see the statue, and then eventually he gets a phone call. We don't know what the phone call's about until we'd have to get that kind of like sinking feeling as he's walking through the hospital that we know what's going to happen. I thought Ed Flanders was very decent in the role as well. He was meant to be playing Dr. Temple, and William O'Malley, who played Dyer in the original, was meant to be coming back, was asked to come back, but he couldn't do it. He's a working vicar, priest, father, so he couldn't do it because of his time. I would have loved to have seen William O'Malley back in the role, just for that familiarity, because the only thing that jarred for me slightly was, obviously, the two actors look nothing like they did in The Exorcist, and I know time has passed, but they're two very different performances, kind of, but they're two very good performances, so it's not something which I'd ever class as a negative.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can understand recasting, because obviously, for example, Lee J. Cobb, I think, had passed him. You couldn't bring him back. So George C. Scott's a very suitable replacement. Just to say, bringing Jason Miller back for the scenes as Patient X, you can understand why they had to do that in the end, in the sense of much as I don't think it's needed. It gives you that tie back to the original film. But yeah, the other actors, you can understand why they recast. As you said, I think a few of the actors in the original were priests.
They were, yeah.
So they could have retired, they could have been unavailable. So you can understand why they decided to get actors in this time, just to balance it out.
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, just for my OCD, just seeing the faces, I have to keep reminding myself that's the same person. But as I always say with with Solo, a Star Wars story, when it came out, the character of Father Dyer is a character. William O'Malley isn't Father Dyer. Father Dyer's the character. So as long as he keeps the same kind of mannerisms and the same tone that William O'Malley brought, then I don't see there is no issue. And I think he did actually, to be honest, as well, because Ed Flanders is a playful Father Dyer, and if you remember in the first film, Father Dyer, to start with, again, he's very playful. He's the way he's sitting at the Kristen McNeil's party, drink in hand, regaling stories to everybody. He's behind the piano telling jokes, and even at the end, he's still kind of that upbeat character. So, and I think Ed Flanders did well with that. And also the fact he's called Ed Flanders always makes me chuckle.
Yeah, he's very good in the role. And I mean, it is a very limited screen time, but he does very good work with what he has, the screen time that he has.
Yeah. Shall we get into that scene? I know you've been dying to talk about it, and I am as well, and I'm pretty sure anyone listening knows exactly what you're talking about. Should we talk about the corridor scene?
We have to talk about the corridor scene.
It's the scene of the film.
Actually, it is the scene of the film, but there's a scene later on in the film that I actually think is really, really clever in its own right. But we'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But if it was up to me, I would make any film person who's wanting to make a supernatural or even a slasher film these days, I'd make them sit down and watch the corridor scene in The Exorcist III.
Yes.
Because what does William Peter Blatty do? He sets the camera up at sort of mid-range.
Yeah, fairly, mid-long range, yeah.
It doesn't. It moves slightly to when the nurse walks towards the camera, towards the room, which is hearing this little noise. It does move slightly, but beyond that, it just stays there. It doesn't move, and you know something's coming. You've got policemen in the background moving around. You know something's coming because of the way the camera is. Because you just don't know what's going to happen. And when it does happen, I don't care how many times you watch that film, it will scare the crap out of you.
It is the way again. I sound like a broken record. It's a silent scene. The only noise you hear is the footsteps of the nurse and the police officers, the doors opening and closing. Putting the pen and the files down. And the only time it deviates is when the nurse goes to check on one of the patients because she hears a noise. And even then, the camera's set as she's in the room in the dark, and you know something's going to happen, but it doesn't happen when you think it does. And then when it does happen, and the guy jumps up. It scared the living shit out of me. And then it comes back. We go back to that shot of the corridor, bright white, and your eyes are kind of drawn. Whilst the nurse is, attending to what she needs to do, your eyes are looking for clues in the shot, and there are no clues. Nothing's there. And again, like you say, you see the policeman. He comes and he sits down. The nurse goes in to check on Dyer, check the rooms. The policeman's another someone else comes in and asks the policeman to come outside, but you kind of notice it, but you don't really register because you're looking for something, you're waiting for something obvious, something horrific, something Exorcist-y, like something climbing off the ceiling or something, which never comes. And then when the scare comes, even like the music or the sound they use, it's just one big sort of note which accompanies it, and bloody hell, it's so well done. And for a film so underrated, and that I think flies under the radar, this is always listed as one of the best, horror movie scenes / jump scares of them all.
It is. I mean, the camera zooms in as you see the figure coming out behind her.
White figure, yeah.
Yeah, and then with the big scissor type things.
She is, yeah.
Yeah, and then it cuts to that statue you were talking about earlier on that's got the head removed. You don't need to see what happens next. That image is all you need. You see the shears, it cuts to the statue with no head. That's all you need to see. It doesn't have to show you the blood, it doesn't have to show you the gore, it doesn't have to show you anything else.
And that's what Blatty does so well, and that's why this scene works. And it's also just the fact that you see the nurse seemingly lock the door. She looks in, nothing's going on. She closes the door to this room and apparently locks it. And then that's when the music comes in, or the sound effect, the zoom, and this figure dressed in this white plastic tarpaulin type thing comes out of these shears, and it comes out of nowhere. And again, if you're watching the scene and looking for clues, you'll notice it actually locks the door. Apparently does. So you don't expect anything to come out of that door. It's just a masterfully shot scene, and as he said, you don't need to see the blood and guts, because what happens to her afterwards is sliced open down the middle, all of her organs are removed, and she's stuffed with rosary beads. Just hearing that is enough for me to think, okay, fine, I don't need to see that. Whereas a film like Seven, which I enjoyed, would probably have shown you a glimpse of it. And I don't mean to compare the two in a disparaging way. It's just a comparison that's there to be made because they're fairly similar films, I think. But I mean, the first time I saw that, it jolted me. And again, even though you know it's coming, I still look for clues on the screen, and I still, semi-jump when I see that.
When I saw the film in 1990 at the cinema release.
Oh yeah.
I remember this is one of the reasons why I actually remember this film very, very strongly. There were a bunch of girls that came in, and they must have been maybe 18. The film was rated 18.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
They would have been round about 18, 19, that age group. And when that scene occurred, it's the first and possibly, I think it's the only time I've heard terrified screaming in a cinema. I've heard audiences shrieking and everything else, but the screaming that came from those girls when that sequence happened, I hate to say this, but I almost had sadistic glee on my face when it happened. It was like, gotcha.
This is Kevin. It's coming out now. This is the true Kevin.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have to admit, as a little, if I've seen a very scary film and I go to see it a second time, part of my enjoyment comes from the audience not knowing what's coming.
Yeah. I would have loved to have seen that because, like you say, with horror films nowadays, you get certain films like Hereditary, which just go for you, which just get you. But I think, and then there are other films like things like Truth or Dare, which is just awful, and Slender Man, where you just don't get that kind of reaction anymore, where people would physically scream, mainly because we've seen it all before, or because there's nothing out there in the mainstream. Because I know how much of a horror fiend you are, so I'm pretty sure you can give me 10, 15 examples where you could do. But I want to go to a film, sit in the dark, and I'd probably be one of the ones who screamed like that. But I want to see a film that elicits such fear and reaction of people, and I would have loved to have seen this film in 1990 in the dark, in like the only time in your life where you're seeing it for the first time, when you've no idea what's coming. Did you jump when it happened, or was it because the girl screamed?
That was actually the second time I saw it.
Okay, first time.
I loved it that much. I went back to see it a second time, but the first time I saw it, while I didn't jump in my seat, I could feel. It scared the crap out of me. I could just feel the tension building, and then when it happens, you could just feel somebody's got that feeling. It's like,
yeah, the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, that's what I got watching that sequence. When I saw it the second time, which is when the girls were in, the sadistic pleasure was the fact that I knew it was coming. They clearly didn't, and it just.
You can imagine Kevin sitting there, rubbing his hands with glee as it's happening, leaning forward in his seat, looking around, waiting. I can anyway. In my head, I'm imagining Kevin 30 years ago, just jumping for joy at that moment. As much as I liked the book Legion, I really did. A good fun fact about that, if you try searching for the audio book, good luck, because the audio book is just a film. It's just a film with the audio of the film, and which is ridiculous. But this scene lends itself to the screen, I think. It's well written, but the full impact comes from seeing it on the screen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what's clever about it is the way it sets it up. I mean, when Kinderman goes to see Father Dyer before he dies, she comes in, the nurse in that sequence comes into the room and gives her name, Amy Keaton.
That's right.
And then later on, when the Gemini killer is basically saying that if he doesn't go to the police, if he doesn't reveal that it's a Gemini killer that's back, he's going to kill somebody, and he's basically going to get to do it his way, as he calls it. He mentions Amy, and it sort of foreshadows what's coming in the sense of her name begins with K. Her last name begins with K. The killer's mentioned her name, so you can kind of see that she's been set up as a victim, but she's not. But at the same time, you still don't know how it's going to happen because of the way the other killings have happened. They've just kind of hinted at the before, and they talked about the aftermath. Here we actually get more of the build-up, and it just frightens the hell out of you.
Yeah, and because she's not like a prevalent character, you'd be forgiven for completely forgetting what her name was. Because the Gemini killer's MO was, he had his way of killing his victims, but he also was going after people whose name began with K or surname, or in some cases middle name, and were kind of connected in some way. Some of the connections are great as well. But yeah, it's K, and of course Kinderman, as we know, obviously is going to be one of the people he's going to target as well. So yeah, that's when she says it, there is that kind of moment of, oh shit, surname's Keating. But when the scene is happening, I'm not even. I find myself not even really thinking that because I'm just still looking for clues, and that's how I think for me why it's such a brilliant scene is that there's so much going on, whilst actually, to be honest, there's nothing happening. It's just somebody going about their job, but your mind starts playing tricks on you, and you're waiting for something. And I would have, again, I would have loved to have seen that for the very first time on the big screen because I think it's such a brilliant shot, and it's a shame that it doesn't get the acclaim it gets, and it's almost kind of seen as it's a great shot in a bad film because we think that ain't true.
Oh no! I mean, it's not a bad film in any way, shape, or form. I mean, when you look at some of the, maybe take for example, even recently, The Curse of La Llorona. I liked it more than most people did, but it's got problems.
Yeah.
The Exorcist III, yes, does have problems, but it is a very, very good film, and more importantly, it's a very, very scary film.
It's an effective film.
A horror film. That's what I want from a horror film. It scares me, and that one does.
Yeah. And it's Blatty came out. Blatty says he actually thinks it's scarier than the original because of the kind of the foreboding atmosphere and what nature of the crimes and what you don't see and what it allows your mind to think of. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. We're never going to know. But we're never going to know. I don't think it is, but it's a close second. He also wanted to get Bill Friedkin to direct this, and whilst it wasn't ever really close, William Friedkin has said, he was on board with the idea of doing it, but he disagreed over the direction of the film where it should have gone. And I'm a big fan of Billy Friedkin's work. I just wonder. Speaking of what we'll never know, is I wonder what a Bill Friedkin Legion would have looked like. Obviously, it would only be conjecture and speculation. Would we have got a corridor scene? Who knows? But that was something that would have interested me as well. I
actually don't think he'd have. Personally, I think I'm glad William Peter Blatty directed it. William Friedkin is a good director. He's made some great films. Don't get me wrong,
mm-hmm.
But I don't think he'd have. Certainly, I do agree. I don't think the hospital corridor sequence would have worked out as well. Having said that, I think he'd have stood up more at the studio than maybe Blatty was forced to.
Yeah.
I think Morgan Creek had gone to William Friedkin and said, "We must have an exorcism." I think William Friedkin would be strong enough to say, "I'm not doing it. It doesn't need it."
In as many words, yes. In Friedkin's inimitable style.
Yeah, but having said that, have you ever seen the Ninth Configuration that William Peter Blatty made? I think about 1980, thereabout.
I have, and again, it's another film which I think flies under the radar because it's for the few films Blatty directed. I mean, the Ninth Configuration may be the best one he did. It's up for debate, but it's a really well-made film.
Yeah, but you can see a lot of thematic connections between that and The Exorcist III. The sort of mental patients, as it were, and the old people with their dementia and Alzheimer's and whatnot, and things like that. So there is a like sort of loose connection to them both, which is why I think Blatty directing it made more sense than Friedkin directing it.
And John Carpenter was going to do it as well until he also said it's clear that Blatty wants to direct this himself because it's his story, it's his vision, it's his passion. He wanted to do it, so we could have had a John Carpenter Exorcist III, which again would have been interesting.
I think Carpenter would have left in the corridor scene.
Yeah, exactly. I just wonder how he would have gone with dealing with the killings and the murders. I don't think he would have gone full Michael Myers, obviously, but I'm just interested to see what he would have done with that side of it. Would it have been less is more, or would he have gone a little bit more into it?
I think his final version would have been closer to what Blatty came up with, in the sense of I think he'd have been happy not to show the murders.
Yep.
And I think he would have had a version of the corridor sequence. Maybe not exactly the same, but I think he'd have put a sequence in like that.
And I mean, thematically as well, this is very similar to, obviously, The Exorcist. We've mentioned in terms of atmosphere, but even just actually the story itself. The Exorcist, we had the scene in the I'll call it, for want of a better word, the sort of the mental hospital, where Father Karras' mother ends up and where she ends up passing away. We have a scene in Exorcist III. Of course, we have the Exorcism at the end. We have a spate of killings which you don't see, that goes through both films, and we have the policeman who doesn't believe, and then by the end actually might do. So there's an awful lot of thematic beats which are the same, but they're different enough where it doesn't feel like a straight up riff on the same story. But I guess that's another reason why it feels so similar, because, and also, let's not forget, it's set in Georgetown, where The Exorcist was, and where Bill Blatty loved that area. Somewhere which I would also very much like to visit, because it's been an ambition of mine to go to Georgetown and, stand on the Exorcist stairs, go to the bar where it's just actually, and the bar where Kinderman and Dyer have their meeting in this film is the same as they did in The Exorcist with Father Karras and, I can't remember his, Father Superior's name. But, so there's a lot that even those connections are the same. But I'd love to go to Georgetown. And again, the opening of this film, I've got to mention that. This film the theatrical opens on a blazing red sun, which then overlooks the lake of Georgetown. Of course, The Exorcist starts with, one of the versions starts with a black and white sun, which becomes red. And it starts in Iraq as well. So there's a lot of similarities with how the film opens as well. So, in terms of being a fully fledged sequel to the first one, I think Blatty did a hell of a job in a lot of ways, but without ever feeling like this is a greatest hits. Because again, it's set in the same place. We've got some of the characters coming back. Some of the themes are recurring, but I think he handled it well enough that it didn't just feel like a straight up rip-off.
Yeah, I think the title is a problem. It has to be said. I think if they had stuck with the title Legion, which is what Blatty wanted, that would have helped. Because they called it The Exorcist III, as I say, that did mean that the studio basically said, we must have an exorcism, which is a shame, because Blatty definitely did not want to do that. You can see that in the way he's made the film. And you can also see that when he adds in the Father Morning sequences, they just jar, because he has no interaction with anything else in the film. Even in the final sequence with them in the cell, I mean, obviously it's been reshot to a degree, but at that point, that's the only time he kind of has a little interaction with Kinderman when he sees his body sort of lying there.
Yeah, when he sees his brain falling out.
Yeah, that is the only connection between the Father Morning stuff and the Kinderman stuff, and it does feel too jarring. I mean, there's no. I mean, why did? I mean, if you wanted to talk sort of flaws of the film,
yeah, go for it.
Even if you accept the film as it is, put aside all the changes that were made because of studio interference and whatnot. Yeah. Father Morning, first see him in his room with a little bird and it dies. And from that, then we next see him in a church praying, and then he goes into the cell to deal with it, to do the exorcism. But there's no link as to say, right, how does he know to go there?
That's true. Because when he turns up, it's kind of like this big... When he turns up at the cell and the door slams open and the lights are flickering, it's kind of like this, like, the heroic entrance. And you're kind of thinking, well, the only time we've seen him here is looking at a dead bird and in a church. And now suddenly he's portrayed as like Arnold Schwarzenegger walking through the door.
Yeah, I mean, visually it's a very impressive shot. But as I say, at that point, it's like, there's no reason for him to be there.
Why, I mean,
did he somehow know it was that Patient X? Did Patient X call out to him in some way? There's no linkage, if you will. So even if you put away, admittedly put to one side all the flaws, the studio interference, it is flawed. The add-on sequences are certainly heavily flawed, and because they just don't fit, and they don't sort of story-wise don't fit either.
Yeah, in the original film, they kind of made it clear that Father Merrin had experience within exorcism, and that the possessed Reagan was aware of Father Merrin before he turned up. They handled that well, so you knew that it was kind of going to be like a final showdown between the two, and it felt earned as well. Whereas this kind of just felt like, yeah, Father Morning just swaggered in as if, and then as he was going to save the day. Well, then he got absolutely handed to him. But and there's in that same shot after he's been on the ceiling and he's had his skull ripped open. Where is he for the rest of the scene? He's not on the floor anywhere. And then a couple of minutes later, he shows up with the crucifix pointing at Karras. But surely his body should have been on the floor somewhere, like visibly on the floor, a pool of blood. It's kind of a really strange, like, that he isn't on there, glaring kind of exemption there. I guess one of the other things that, taking the film on face value, we can ignore the book or anything else, taking the film on face value, Kinderman is portrayed as being, he says, Damien Karras is my best friend, I loved him. But we never get that sense in The Exorcist, because I can see how Dyer and Kinderman would strike up a friendship. The end of The Exorcist, or, Blatty's preferred end, has the two walking off to go and watch It's a Wonderful Life, or go and get some lunch and talk film. You could see how over 17 years, they would become friends. Father Karras had a few interactions with Kinderman, and usually that was then kind of tempered by the fact that Kinderman was onto something. So it's slightly odd that they would portray him as Karras' best friend, and that he would get depressed at that time of the year because his best buddy died.
Yeah, I do agree that from a is an issue in the film. If you look at compare it back to the original Exorcist, the Exorcist, you're quite right. The original Exorcist never gives you that impression between Kinderman and Karras. I can only presume they did that to add a bit more emotional heft to the aspect of the fact that this could be his old friend back from the dead. That's the only explanation I can come up with for that one. They must have decided, Blatty must have decided while writing it, that just to tweak that relationship more, make them more friendly in the past. So when he realizes who patient X might be, it hits him harder, as it were. Yeah.
And the book, The Exorcist, actually, there are scenes in that with Kinderman and Karras bonding, if you will. But again, that's then having to read expositionary material. Just on face value, that's probably like the one. It's not an issue. It didn't. In no way did it actually negatively impact the film for me. But it's extremely noticeable for me. The first time I saw it, having watched The Exorcist before, knowing their relationship, and then having this suddenly say he was my best friend. I was like, well, he hasn't had that time to bond with him because Karras has been dead. So how has he been friendly with him? So that was one of the major issues. I guess in terms of flaws with the film, there aren't an awful lot, and I try to say this as subjectively as possible. There's a few things. Some of the effects later on in the film are jarring, like you mentioned in the exorcism scene. And when you're at Kinderman's house and the possessed nurse goes to cut his daughter's head off, all moves a bit fast and a bit sort of the camera works a bit shaky there. But it doesn't ruin the film for me, and I don't think there's anything really for me anyway. And I'm really racking my brains here. Again, I only rewatched a couple of days ago, but there's nothing that I can think of that jumps out that I really dislike and think, actually, I would have preferred if that wasn't in there. There are kind of nice to haves and, that could have done with not being there, like the dream sequence, but it doesn't ruin the film for me. Is there anything, do you reckon there's anything in there that actually kind of negatively impacts your enjoyment of it?
Honestly, there isn't. No, for all the flaws, the likes of the exorcism, I do think the way some of the characters just kind of just drop that from the storyline. For example, I think it's roughly after Kinderman dies. After Father Dyer dies, most of the police investigation seems to be dropped. You hardly ever see any of the police officers after that. And then in the final act, the nurse who was in the cell with patient X, reading the readout, she completely vanishes as well. Now, yes, you can argue that's because they had to reshot certain things and whatnot and everything else, and they changed it up. But little details like that, I didn't notice at the time, and it didn't spoil my enjoyment. And even noticing them now still doesn't detract from my enjoyment. And for all the flaws of the exorcism, as I said, you still get that great speech from Kinderman about belief.
And
yes, you can there are flaws in there. There's no question of that. But the flaws that it has does not spoil my enjoyment of that film.
No, and there are parts of the exorcism scene that are pretty good. Taking it as at face value, the shot with Jason Miller's Father Karras / Gemini Killer / Patient X, the way he just looks at Father Morning as he uses the force to throw him against the ceiling. Jason Miller, his face in that scene is fantastic, and obviously then seeing Father Morning's body just tearing apart on the ceiling is it's rough to watch because it looks horrendous, and the noises, that sort of like the Velcro-y sound of his skin ripping from his skull, and like the pain scream is, that's a tough watch. It's it's not a nice scene to watch. So taking it like little pieces of the main puzzle are really good, and I think Jason Miller is very good in that scene, and the way he's looking at Father Morning with his head cocked as he's basically just tearing him to shreds is brilliant. But then, you get like hell rising and snakes and all this other stuff, and that's when you see the Kintry boy crucifix and stuff like that. It's when they kind of sort of go balls out. That's the one part which doesn't feel right, which we've mentioned. Everybody knows that, but parts of it are fine still.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a trailer that was released. I think it was one of the first trailers, which featured the image of, which ties in with the original title Legion, of the Gemini killer / Karis's face repeatedly changing into others.
Yeah, the morphine scene, yeah.
Yes, it does. In the trailer, it looked okay, but I haven't seen the trailer for a very long time, so my memory could be playing tricks on me on that one. It would have been interesting to see how that scene would have played out in the film. Maybe that was one of the cuts they made when the studio decided to interfere. But there is a trailer out there on YouTube somewhere that does actually have that sequence in it.
And that would have played at the end, wouldn't it? When around the time of Kinderman's speech as he's pinned to the wall. I think it was towards the end. Yeah, it was going to morph between James Veneman, Brad Dorff, and Patient X's face, and again. I think Blatty took it out because he wasn't happy the way it looked. In terms of...
sorry, you could very well be right there. As I say, I haven't seen the actual... I saw it in the trailer very briefly. I honestly can't remember how it looked.
I don't remember it looking great. But again, in 1990, it may have looked better. It may have looked fine. Obviously, now looking back at it, it doesn't look that great, to be honest. But speaking of the trailer showing Jason Miller, I know his name was on the credits and that, but... Nowadays, do you think they would have tried to hide the fact that Jason Miller was coming back?
I think it would all depend on when if you were to say, if the Exorcist III was being made now, I think had the Exorcist been made in the last 10 years, I think they would have tried to hide it. I think, to put it into context, there's a rumour going around, for example, that, and I stress it's only a rumour, that Jack Nicholson is going to be making an appearance of sorts in Doctor Sleep.
Interesting.
Now, as I say, this is a rumour. Whether it's a case of just unused footage from The Shining, and they're just incorporating that into the film, or what, I've really no idea. Or even if the rumour is true, and it's just somebody's put that out there just to sort of bit of mischief. But that being said, if it's true, I'd like to have not known that, because that would be an interesting, a genuine surprise if Nicholson was to turn up in The Shining. In the case of The Exorcist, and The Exorcist III, I don't think a lot of people would recall who Jason Miller actually is, because he's not really a well-known actor. So unless they knew The Exorcist, they probably wouldn't know who he was.
And it's before the internet.
Whether his name was, it would be a bit of a surprise, I think, if you know The Exorcist. If you don't know The Exorcist, it wouldn't make any difference, I don't think.
That's true. And again, nowadays you've got, IMDb has been around for a long time, but nowadays all you've got to do is Google it or go online, and you'd find out straight away who it is. But I think they would have tried to hide it and tried to make it a big kind of like dun 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 moment in the film, which I think could have worked well. But I mean, I'm glad that it hasn't been made now, because I think it works better being made when it did. Because there's something about those old films from that era, which the visual look of them is what brings me back to them. Well, but it's one of those. This is one of the films like this, and obviously the Exorcist, which please don't ever remake. And I can't imagine that anyone's ever going to say, you know what? I think we should remake Legion again. But it's a product of its time, and it hasn't dated all that badly, I don't think, as well. I think, like you mentioned, because it's so kind of grounded for the most part, it holds up to this day. I think certainly does. I mean, if you're going to remake it today, I think you'd have to get somebody. I can't actually think of a director who could shoot it possibly the way
the way it needs to be shot. These days you have all these moving cameras going round the James. I mean, I hate to blame James Wan for it because he does it very, very well.
You'd probably get him on board, even though he's the completely wrong person to do it.
Because I mean, I actually, I mean, a lot of people don't like the way he does his horror films, but I'm a big fan. I do find the jump scares in them very effective. Whether the whole film's a scary thing entirely is a different thing entirely, but the scares I think work very, 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 very well. But he uses a moving camera a lot. The key to The Exorcist, I think, is the fact the camera very rarely moves.
It's true. Yep.
I mean, if you look at this a lot, I mean, some of the shots, for example, you see Kinderman on one side of the room, you see the Gemini killer / Karis on the other side of the room. The sequence where they're talking about Father Dyer's body, it's shot from up above, looking down, and you've got the two actors, Kinderman and the morgue attendant. Sorry, on one side, you've got another detective on the other side, and all they do is talk about what they found. A lot of the things these days that would all be cut together in different ways, but Blatty doesn't like to move the camera a lot. You know, if you notice in a lot of scenes, and I think that makes the film more powerful. Yeah,
people move within the frame rather than the frame moving with the characters, and I like that because again, it focuses your attention on what's happening within the scene, not the kind of choppy editing and getting different angles of the same actor's face or the over-the-shoulder shots, and it's more effective. And I think it's more of a it's a greater filmmaking technique to show that kind of restraint. And yeah, I get nothing against James Wan. Some of the effects in Aquaman scared the shit out of me, but But The Conjuring, though, I think The Conjuring is a fabulous horror film, and it lends itself to these kind of films of this era because, firstly, it's set in the 70s. It feels like a film from those days, and it was slightly more restrained because it felt more practical than, say, other films in the Conjuring universe. But yeah, I mean, James Wan doing an Exorcist 3, I don't know. I think they could, again, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I could see them going for somebody who isn't a out-and-out horror director. I think they could go for somebody who's more attuned in that kind of in that mystery drama kind of aesthetic, rather than as a straight up horror director. But again, look, Mike Flanagan, if he does well with Doctor Sleep, he did well with Gerald's Game. I quite enjoyed Hush. Maybe Mike Flanagan would be a good shout.
I actually think who could do it well, and this is maybe slightly out of left field because it'd be interesting to see how he would approach it. I think something like Christopher Nolan.
That would certainly get people watching.
Yeah, I think because Nolan is definitely a fan of cinema.
Yes.
And I actually think, because it'd be interesting to see how he would take possibly a Kubrick approach. I mean, everybody compares Nolan to Kubrick. I mean, it's an unfair comparison. But that being said, it'd be interesting to see his approach to doing something like The Exorcist 3, or even The Exorcist if they want to remake that, which you can rest assured somebody somewhere will come up with that idea.
I think no film is untouchable, and I think one day they will do. And as much as to me, it's a masterpiece. It's flawless. If somebody did remake it, of course I'm going to go and see it, and I'm going to go and watch it with an open mind. But I don't think anything's ever going to top. I mean, everyone's got their favourite film, and obviously we've heard things like The Princess Bride is apparently going to be remade. Not sure why. But a lot of people are saying, why? Why would you do that? Because you're not going to improve upon it. For me, you can't improve upon The Exorcist. For lots of people, you probably can. And to be honest, the Fox TV series of The Exorcist, the first season was fabulous, I thought. Second season was pretty damn good as well, and then they cancelled it because of the ratings. But so it goes to show that you can create a good Exorcist story with certain stylistic nods. But doing the same film nowadays, I mean, what made this film and The Exorcist so powerful was the fact that it was real people and real work. And I don't disparage CGI and visual animators because those guys work their asses off to create some magnificent looking movies. But can you imagine like the head turning scene in The Exorcist now? Or the pea soup? Or even like the crucifix scene, would that be in it? The masturbation scene? I mean, how would they do it? It's things like that. I mean, how would they do it for today's audience? And things like The Exorcist 3. How could you do it for today's audience, which would keep them engaged, but also horrify them as well? Could you do it?
Yeah.
Or are we in a different time now?
I think if you take The Exorcist 3 first, I think you could make that film these days and not change a lot. I think you could get away with making that film as it is. I think The Exorcist would have problems, I think,
Yeah.
these days. Not amongst horror fans, don't get me wrong. I think, well, apart from the fact that it had been remade, don't get me
Yes.
put that to one side. But I think if you made that film now, I think things like the crucifix masturbation scene, I think would almost certainly have people up in arms these days on social media and whatnot. The spinning head thing, I think, would probably have several comments. And even if you take, for example, in the director's cut, well, I think it's the director's cut, the spider walk down
the
stairs.
version you've never seen or whatever it's called, yeah.
Yeah. And things like that. Yeah. Put them back in the film, I don't have a problem with that. The spinning head's the one moment in the film, actually, I do have a problem with.
Because she would have broken her neck?
That's pretty much it,
Severed her spine?
Yeah, I mean, that aside, that's the only problem I really have with the original Exorcist.
Because I'm a fanboy, I'm willing to overlook that. But it is obviously something which is clear, obvious. I just see it as a horrifying thing to see, rather than obviously thinking, yes, that would have detached her spine from her skull.
Well, from a visual perspective, it's terrifying.
Scientifically, yeah, it's wrong.
But as I say, from a sort of practical point of view, yeah, she probably snapped her neck.
Yeah, there would have been a short film directed by William Friedkin. The spider walk would probably be overextended now. I can imagine her being Reagan chasing around the house in that. But I mean,
yeah.
Listen, you never know. When they could remake that film, and it could actually end up being fantastic. Nothing to say it couldn't be. Exorcist III, actually, though, onto that, I agree with you that that there is a chance that they could remake Exorcist III and improve upon it in a lot of ways. Like we say, in terms of the ending, or just in terms of if they're going to have an exorcism, they would be able to hint and nod towards it more so during the film. So if they're going to have a Father Morning type character, he could be not a main character, but alluded to more within the film and actually potentially interact with people more. So there are ways that they can improve on the flaws. Whether it would be a better film or not, again, because there are moments in this film which are, it's a word I don't like, but iconic. There's certain things, but do you try to recreate that, or do you go for something different? That's the kind of thing I'm interested in with a remake, with any kind of remake.
I think if they were to remake it, I mean, as I say, I could see somebody, for example, if Peter Blatty was to shoot that film now, I don't think he would change it, apart from maybe making it more his way. If somebody was to remake it, a different filmmaker, I think, and I may be a bit harsh here, I think they might be more focused on the murders at the start.
Yeah, okay.
I think certainly I quite agree that if they're going to do them, make it as it is, the Father Morning character needs to be more integrated into the story. But I think if you get the right director with the courage of the studio to let them do it, I think they would be quite happy to shoot Blatty's original vision.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of a studio maybe who'd let them do that. Blumhouse maybe, but and they're getting they'll be low budget but big returns.
I think Warner Brothers, depending on their day of the week. I mean, if you think about it, Warner Brothers have made a hash of their DC
Warner Brothers
property.
needs a hit, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, they let George Miller go off into the desert and come back with Mad Max with little interference. Which
is a wild film. Whichever way you look at it, is a bonkers film. Which, it looks the sort of film which is ripe for a studio to say, no, that's not commercially viable, and look how it ended up.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, and that's I think when you think about it, that is Warner Brothers. So it depends on which day of the week you got hold of Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers will let George Miller go off and do insane things in the desert for Fury Road, and then will basically interfere with Justice League, Suicide Squad, Batman, Superman, all this kind of stuff. So you never know what they would do if somebody said to them, I want to remake The Exorcist, or I want to do The Exorcist 3 or whatever.
You know damn well if somebody says we want to remake The Exorcist, Warner Brothers are green lighting that straight away because dollar signs. The day somebody said we're remaking this, it's one of the top 5-10 anticipated films of that year.
Unless you've got all the horror fans boycotting it.
Of course, anticipating in the sense of there'll be a lot of people thinking who want to see it out of just more but pure curiosity. There'll be the horror fans who are absolutely against the idea of it. There'll be people like me who wouldn't be entirely happy with the idea. But damn, I'll be damned if I'm not going to go and see it. There'll be casual fans who just happen to know the IP. There'll be people who are too young to see the original or thought the original was quote unquote hilarious who are going to go and see it. So I think it would garner a hell of a lot of attention. But I say Warner Brothers needs a hit. Joker may end up winning Best Picture in the next few weeks. But recently they've had. Obviously, It Chapter 2 is bringing in the money, but it wasn't great. Give me things like Annabelle. That series isn't doing great. It's hit and miss. They've had a Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Fantastic Beasts hasn't done well. The Nun. Kong Skull Island was okay, but it didn't break the box office. And so I think Warner Brothers could do with a hit. Now, would The Exorcist 3 be that hit? Maybe not.
I think to be honest though, Doctor Sleep. Going back to using Doctor Sleep as a comparison, which I think Warner Brothers are releasing, funny enough.
Yeah.
That gets away with it because you've got the distance between that and The Shining.
Yeah.
But the problem Doctor Sleep has, and I'm no off tangent here, but I'll make the point in a second, is it going to be based on King's novel, or is it going to be in the sense of in The Shining?
Yes.
The events in The Shining, or is it going to be based on events from the Kubrick film?
I think it's the Kubrick film, I think.
Which I'm wondering how King's going to feel about that, because he's not a big fan of Kubrick's film.
Didn't like it at all, did he?
But there is that distance of what, 30 about 30 years between the two?
About 40-something years now, yeah. So I think 1980-something, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think if you're going to remake something like The Exorcist 3, I hate to say this, but you're probably going to have to do The Exorcist first.
It would make sense because, again, you are rebooting a third film, which would then tie into the first film, which would by then be about 50 years old. And yeah, it wouldn't, even just like visually, it would jar.
Never mind visually. I think just from the story perspective, in that the characters are too far apart in the sense that most of the characters who had survived The Exorcist, even for 50 years, most of them would be dead by now.
Yeah.
So like I said, you'd have to do The Exorcist, let's say, for example, you did The Exorcist next year. Oof. I think you'd have to do Legion probably within the next 2 or 3 years after that, rather than this whole 30-year period.
I've just got this horrifying image of them trying to make a franchise out of this now, of having the first film and then having the actors come back 4 years later, and then in between that they got spin-offs like, what was Father Dyer doing in between and all that kind of stuff. I've got this horrible like cinematic universe feeling going on now. It's scary.
There you go. Combine it with The Conjuring. Problem solved.
The best parts of The Conjuring anyway, they could do it with. I like that first film with The Conjuring, and I liked Annabelle Creation. I thought that was good.
I actually like Annabelle Comes Home. It's not, don't get me wrong, it's not as good as Creation, but it's one of those films that I know is, I think, a good introduction for teenagers who are maybe not old enough for like the actual proper horror films.
Yeah,
it works for, I would say it works for teenagers, young adults.
Yeah.
That one, as opposed to The Conjuring, which I think is an adult's horror film.
Yeah, Conjuring scared the living arse out of me when I first saw it. It really did. I really liked that film.
I'm a fan. I mean, even the weaker films in the Conjuring, so-called Conjuring universe, I do enjoy them. But yeah, the actual Conjuring films themselves are the best films in that series.
Looking forward to The Conjuring 3 coming up this year. So speaking of third films, so to kind of like wrap up on Exorcist 3 now, which you never want to do because it's a great film. In terms of like, because we're mentioning now about reboots, we've mentioned before that it's underrated and all this. What kind of legacy do you think this film has? Because we love it, and obviously there's plenty of other people who love it as well. But what kind of legacy do you think Exorcist 3 has, given everything that surrounds this Exorcist kind of saga?
I think, sadly, it's more of a footnote in the Exorcist saga, because the original Exorcist is such a highly regarded, one of the scariest films ever made. The Exorcist II, The Heretic, let's be brutally honest about this, is one of the worst sequels / worst films ever made.
Yeah, it is.
Exorcist III redresses the balance somewhat, but it's from a time perspective, it's too far behind Exorcist II to make its full impact. I don't know when Moe and Peter Blatty wrote the novel, but it's approximately 15 years since The Exorcist happened.
Yep. I think he wrote the novel within the decade before the film was released.
Yeah, I think had the film come out about 1980, I think it would have a much bigger impact. But it came out, I think, at the wrong time, because that's in 1990. You had your slasher films, sort of World War well, not CGI, but your what's the word I'm looking
More
for?
effects laden films.
Sorry, you're correct. Yeah, effects laden films, and it kind of went against everything that was coming out for horror at that point to a degree, and I think that's part of the reason why it was kind of looked as a curiosity. Those that like the film really liked the film. Even those that maybe weren't a huge fan of it do concede that it's got a lot of good stuff in it. But I think for the horror fan at the time, it just came out at the wrong period.
Yeah, in the early 90s as well, things were skewing more towards the thriller aspect as well. Obviously, you've got things like Silence of the Lambs, Hand on the Rock Cradle, and things like that. So there was a shift in people's cinema going habits as well. Yeah, I agree. In terms of its legacy, it is annoyingly and sadly a footnote, and it is partly because of The Heretic. The Heretic damaged the brand, if you will, almost irreparably, to the fact that a film as solid and as great as Exorcist III is written off because of its connection with The Heretic, simply because it shares the same word in the title. And then, of course, after that, you get Dominion and The Beginning, which did nothing to help. And it's interesting that we say that had this film been called Legion, it would have succeeded. Paul Schrader's Dominion was just called Dominion. I know it had a sub note as well, like the prequel to Exorcist, but it was just called Dominion, and the studio binned that, literally threw it in the bin. But I think the films around it, aside from the original, have let this film down, because this film actually deserves to be seen by a wider audience. It deserves better, because, again, I love this film. Is it the best horror film of all time? No, it's not. But it's a damn fine horror film. What Blatty managed to do was brilliant, how he kept the spirit of the original, and I do think it's underrated. I think it's having a bit more of a resurgence. The fact that Scream or Shout Factory have managed to actually get a Blu-ray released of the director's cut is testament to that, and there are more and more people who are finding this film or appreciating it more. When I put out a poll on Instagram recently, didn't do too well though. Basically said, were you a fan of The Exorcist III? 37% said yes, 63% said no. Now, I'd be interested to see the reasoning behind that, because whether it is because I just didn't like the film, or whether it's because the kind of taboo subject of this franchise now, and not even a TV series could save it. And I quite enjoyed that TV series. But in terms of a legacy, The Exorcist III is kind of an underrated one. It was Jeffrey Dahmer's favourite film, if that's anything.
Not really going to recommend it to the general public, it has to be said.
No, come and watch this. Jeffrey Dahmer thought it was a hoot. It's not the kind of thing you want as a tagline, do you?
Yeah, but I do agree. I think. I have been pushing my local independent cinema who do horror screening, cult film screenings throughout the years. I've been kind of pushing them every so often to say, look, put this on, it'll go down very well. So far, nothing. But I keep hoping that they'll put it on.
I would love to go and see it on the big screen. It doesn't matter how many times I've seen this film, I'd love to see it on the big screen. And again, mainly just for those scenes we mentioned, the confession box scene, which the more I think about it, is a brilliant scene, the way it's just shot, and the horrible sort of rising sense of dread that you get. And of course, the corridor scene. And also just to see whether the exorcism scene looks good on the big screen now, because I haven't seen it, whereas you have. I'd love to see it on the big screen with the full-on theatre sound.
There is a sequence later on, earlier in the film, where you see the Joker statue in a corridor. It's gone into darkness.
Yeah,
that sequence there is creepy in its own right, and I think that scene would go down very, very well with an audience. But to put it into context, I went to a screening of The Exorcist a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the audience was really up for it until the actual exorcism. And then what happened was, the power of Christ compels you sequence. Yep. It brought laughter from the audience. So I think you have to have the right audience. To put that into context, you mentioned It earlier. I went to screening of It Chapter 1 at my local independent cinema. And they were terrified of it. The first one, and they were shrieking and everything else at certain moments, everything else. But when I saw it in multiplex, there was nothing.
It's interesting. That's an interesting idea, that or thought or reasoning. When I saw it, I saw it in a smaller theatre, and I had people behind me who were, I don't think their asses stayed in the seat for too long because they were jumping and they were squealing. I think it wouldn't have been anywhere near as much as your screening of Exorcist III in 1990 where the girls just lifted the roof off. But there was an obvious reaction to the film. But I mean, I saw Hereditary. I've said this before on many of my shows, and I need to rewatch Hereditary because whilst I enjoyed it, the whole thing was ruined because after about halfway, the crowd just went. Basically, the crowd just lost anything, and there were people laughing, shouting at the screen, mocking the film. Again, everybody, if you don't like the film, that's fair enough, but you're in a film, shut up in a cinema. So I'll be as polite as possible. If you're in a film, if you don't like it, either leave or shut up because other people are trying. So the actual impact of like that mad sort of last third was lost on me because I just couldn't get into the film. So I agree that certain films relies on the audience, and I would love to go back and rewatch The Exorcist in cinemas with the right audience, because the audiences I've seen it with have for the most part been on board.
Yeah, I think certainly with older horror films, I think you need the right audience for it to be fully effective, because a lot of them watch things like, mentioned The Conjuring, that kind of film with the jump scares. Mm-hmm. When you get something these days that doesn't do that, you find they just lose interest because they're waiting for the skits so they can sort of jump for a little while, have a nervous laugh. And then when you get a film like The Exorcist III, for example, which doesn't have those, apart from that one scene, it's just because of a sense of building dread all the way throughout. I think a lot of young, I think it's still an 18-rated film by today's standards.
Yes, it is, yeah.
But I think, even so, I think a lot of people would be, I hate to say the word, I think they would find it bored. They would be bored by it because it doesn't have the jump scares that they're expecting.
It takes its time in telling its story, which is what a good film does. I mean, Christ, imagine if they watched Rosemary's Baby or something like that. Jesus, they are also changing. I don't think they better handle it. But you know what people say? If you laugh during a horror film, it's because you're genuinely scared. That's what I always believe as well. So I guess that kind of wraps up our Exorcist 3 chat. I don't need to ask whether Kevin enjoys the film because we know he does because he's on this podcast talking about it. So, but what I will say is we all know the answer, but if anybody out there hasn't seen this film, I'm going to assume you're going to tell them you're going to recommend this to them.
I will recommend this film to everybody who will listen to me.
And if anyone doesn't take the Film Grump's word for it, you don't know film.
I appreciate that.
No worries. And obviously, Kevin mentioned Banana Splits and The Wind as well earlier on for a couple of more modern films, because we don't mean to crap on modern horror, because there's some fabulous modern horror films out there. So check those out, because I'm certainly going to go and check those out, and hopefully I enjoyed them as much as Kevin did. But that is, as I say, that for the first episode of Retrospectives from the Back Row. It's been an absolute blast talking The Exorcist III, and I'm so glad to actually finally be able to fully get into this film with someone. So Kevin, thank you so much for giving your time to come on tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. So if people want to come and find your work, and let's face it, why wouldn't they? Where online can they find you?
I am under the Grumpy Kev on Twitter, but you can find my blog at the Grump of Horror on WordPress. And
are you as grumpy as your usernames say?
I can neither confirm or deny that.
Yeah, follow Kevin, make your own mind up. But honestly, Kevin's work's very good, and he's always active online as well with some great takes. If you want to find me, you can find me at whatIwatchtonight.co.uk, on Rotten Tomatoes as well, or just across all the socials, What I Watched Tonight. If you like this show, share it with your friends. If you know someone who likes The Exorcist 3, tell them there's two guys who just shoot the breeze about it. For better and worse, it's not a full-on sycophantic look at it. Tell them, maybe they want to hear it as well. Share the show about it as well. But, however, thank you so much for listening, guys. And until next time, see ya.